Namaskar and welcome back to The Explainer. So glad you're here. Today, we're diving straight into a massive, frankly mind-bending shift in the economic history of the subcontinent. We're going to look at how an entire nation's economic DNA was just systematically rewired during colonial rule. Specifically, how a few incredibly targeted trade policies completely flipped India's position on the global stage. Let's get right into it.
So you know the baseline, right? Since ancient times, India was this absolute powerhouse of global trade, a massive trading nation known everywhere for high-value goods. But then colonial rule kicks in and highly restrictive policies are slapped onto commodity production, trade, and tariffs. It literally choked the old system. Basically, the nation goes from being this thriving global manufacturing hub to, well, a highly restricted captive supplier of primary raw materials, a total 180-degree turn.
Which brings us to our first point. The Great Reversal, from manufacturing hub to captive supplier.
To put it simply, India was forced into becoming a mere exporter of raw stuff. We're talking raw silk, cotton, wool, sugar, indigo, jute, all of that raw wealth just being aggressively shipped out. And in return, India had to import the finished goods. The very same cotton and silk came back as finished clothes, along with capital goods like light machinery straight off the assembly lines of British factories. The real wealth, the value addition, it was entirely shifted overseas.
Moving on to Section 2, Britain's monopoly control, dominating the trade flow.
So who is controlling all this trade? Well, for all practical purposes, Britain just locked down a strict monopoly. More than half, yes, over 50% of all of India's foreign trade was restricted exclusively to Britain. The leftovers? They were only permitted with a tiny handful of nations, like China, Ceylon, which we now know as Sri Lanka, and Persia, or modern-day Iran. India's vast historical global reach was just cleanly severed.
Section 3. The Suez Canal Effect, tightening the grip.
Now, add global geography to the mix. The opening of the Suez Canal was obviously a game-changer for world navigation. But for colonial India, it wasn't just some handy shortcut. It was a tool for intense economic control. It drastically cut the travel time between Britain and India, which meant extracting raw materials and dumping finished goods became faster, cheaper, and incredibly efficient for the British. It just tightened the vice grip on the economy.
Next up, Section 4. The cost of surplus, an illusion of wealth.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting and honestly a bit deceptive. Throughout this whole colonial period, India was actually generating a massive export surplus. Now, if you look at that on paper today, hearing export surplus sounds fantastic, right? You'd think, wow, booming economy, producing more than it consumes, rolling in wealth. But in this specific historical context, that term is a complete illusion.
Because the dark reality of that huge surplus was the agonizing cost it inflicted back home. All those raw materials were being aggressively pushed out of the country, leaving the local population with literally next to nothing. We are talking severe, widespread shortages of the most basic, essential commodities, a critical lack of food grains, a massive scarcity of clothes. The wealth was exported, sure, but the poverty? That stayed right at home.
Which wraps up our explainer for today. And I really want to leave you pondering this, because it's so crucial. Context is absolutely everything with economic data. Does an export surplus always mean a nation is wealthy? Or, as we've just seen, can it actually be a mask for the systematic extraction of a nation's lifeblood? It's wild to think how colonial economics turned what looks like a success on paper into a devastating reality for millions. Thanks so much for joining me today. Keep questioning those numbers, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.